You realize you're just my backup option, right? She smirked, so I smiled, thanks, and blocked her everywhere. Today she showed up at my workplace crying while I'm planning my honeymoon with my soulmate who chose me first. Sometimes the best revenge is just living well while someone else's life falls apart from their own terrible choices. I'm Drew, and this is the story of how I learned the difference between being someone's safety net and being someone's first choice. Victoria and I had been together for 5 years, living in our century-old Victorian house in Minneapolis that we'd been painstakingly restoring room by room with the kind of methodical care that historical homes demand if you want to preserve their character instead of just gutting them like most people do. I worked as an electrical contractor while studying for my master electrician certification, pulling 12-hour days running conduit through century-old walls that hadn't been touched since the Coolidge administration, then coming home to spend evenings memorizing electrical codes and safety regulations while sitting at our restored oak dining table. She managed social media campaigns for various Minneapolis startups, crafting Instagram posts and coordinating influencer partnerships from her laptop at our kitchen table while I rewired another section of our house, the sound of her typing mixing with my drill and the old radiators clanking to life. Our weekends were spent knee-deep in renovation projects that would have broken weaker couples, me handling the electrical work and plumbing while she researched historical paint colors and hunted down period-appropriate fixtures at architectural salvage yards scattered throughout the Twin Cities, places where you could find original crystal doorknobs and hand-forged hinges if you knew what to look for. The house had become our masterpiece, each room representing months of shared labor and countless Saturday trips to obscure antique shops where Victoria would geek out over original crown molding and hand-forged hardware while I calculated how much rewiring each room would need to bring it up to modern safety standards without destroying the historical integrity. We discovered that beneath decades of terrible renovations lay beautiful original hardwood floors, intricate plasterwork, and pocket doors that just needed someone who cared enough to restore them properly instead of ripping them out for some bland open-concept nightmare. When her career started taking off with bigger tech company contracts, startups willing to pay premium rates for her creative campaigns that somehow made overpriced apps seem essential, I proudly took on extra electrical jobs, working commercial sites and emergency calls to fund her professional photography equipment and advanced marketing courses because I genuinely believed we were building something meaningful together. She'd gotten excited about a new camera lens or editing software, showing me color-corrected photos of local businesses she'd worked with, and I'd pick up an extra weekend job installing electrical panels in some strip mall to make it happen because seeing her passionate about her work made me genuinely happy. We had concrete, detailed plans to start our own renovation consulting business once I earned my master certification, combining my technical expertise with her marketing skills to flip historical properties throughout the Twin Cities area where old homes were being destroyed by developers who didn't understand their value or craftsmanship. Victoria had already designed mock-up websites and business cards featuring before and after photos of our own house, researching target neighborhoods and potential profit margins while I mapped out the electrical and plumbing challenges we'd likely encounter in different eras of Minneapolis housing, from 1890s Queen Anne's to 1920s bungalows. She'd created detailed spreadsheets projecting costs and timelines, and I'd contributed my knowledge of what lurked behind old walls, knob and tube wiring, galvanized pipes, asbestos insulation, so we could bid jobs accurately instead of getting buried in unexpected expenses like most amateur flippers. Looking back, I realize I was the only one who actually believed in those plans, but at the time everything felt solid and real, like we were laying the foundation for a life that would matter beyond just making money. Victoria would curl up next to me while I studied electrical codes in the evenings, sometimes helping me memorize safety regulations while we planned which house we'd tackle next and debated the merits of period-accurate restoration versus modern convenience, her head on my shoulder while we flipped through real estate listings and dreamed about turning forgotten houses into homes again. I thought we were partners working toward the same future, two people who'd found something worth building together with our own hands and vision. But apparently I was just funding her real dreams while she figured out what she actually wanted from life. And what she wanted didn't include a guy who worked with his hands and came home covered in sawdust and wire insulation, smelling like construction sites instead of the trendy coffee shops where her successful clients spent their days. The shift started so gradually that I almost missed it, like watching paint fade over months instead of noticing it happen all at once. Victoria began making subtle comments about my traditional mindset whenever I suggested practical solutions to her business challenges, rolling her eyes when I mentioned that maybe expanding into commercial electrical work would give us more financial stability than chasing the latest tech trends her startup clients were obsessed with. "Drew, you think like a contractor," she'd say with this new edge in her voice, "but the world is moving toward innovation and disruption, not just fixing old things." Her networking events started yielding connections with entrepreneurs and venture capitalists who hung out at trendy Minneapolis co-working spaces, and our dinner conversations became filled with stories about her clients' boyfriends who were software startup founders and cryptocurrency investors living in those expensive downtown Minneapolis lofts with floor-to-ceiling windows and exposed brick. She'd describe their lifestyles with this wistful tone, talking about weekend trips to Aspen and Tesla Roadsters like they were normal things that successful people just had. Marcus bought his girlfriend a Cartier watch for their 6-month anniversary, she'd mention casually while I calculated whether we could afford to replace our ancient washing machine. His app just got acquired by Google for $12 million. I'd nod and continue eating the dinner I'd cooked while she scrolled through LinkedIn, wondering when exactly I'd become the boring boyfriend who represented everything she was trying to escape. Everything shifted dramatically when Victoria met Sloan at an exclusive digital marketing summit in Chicago, some boutique conference that cost $1,500 just to attend and featured speakers who'd built million-dollar Instagram accounts selling lifestyle coaching to desperate people. Sloan owned a boutique agency specializing in luxury lifestyle brands, the kind of operation that charged corporate clients $50,000 to create social media strategies for products that cost more than most people's cars. Victoria came back from that conference absolutely transformed, talking nonstop about Sloan's vision for elevated brand experiences and how Minneapolis was too small market for the kind of high-end work that really mattered in the industry. Sloan thinks I have serious potential, she announced, showing me glossy photos of Sloan's Chicago office with its minimalist furniture and abstract art that probably cost more than my truck. She says my aesthetic sense is being wasted on these local tech startups that don't understand real luxury positioning. Victoria started spending entire weekends in Chicago at Sloan's agency, claiming they were collaborating on high-end campaigns that required extensive planning sessions and client meetings that I was never invited to attend or even hear details about. These trips became more frequent and mysterious, with Victoria returning home each Monday looking like she'd stepped out of a fashion magazine instead of the vintage band t-shirts and comfortable jeans she used to prefer. Her style transformed completely to match Sloan's aesthetic, the kind of minimalist, expensive clothing featured in Sloan's Instagram posts of trendy coffee shops and rooftop meetings where everything looked carefully curated and effortlessly wealthy. Sloan's teaching me about personal branding, Victoria explained when I asked about her sudden wardrobe overhaul. Image is everything in this business, and I need to look the part if I want to attract premium clients. The clothes weren't cheap either. I noticed the credit card bills showing purchases from stores I'd never heard of, places where a simple black sweater cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. But whenever I brought up money, Victoria would get defensive and lecture me about investing in your professional image, like I was some peasant who didn't understand how successful people operated. She started talking differently too, using phrases like brand synergy and elevated consumer experiences in normal conversations, as if she was practicing for some job interview I wasn't aware of. Our house restoration projects, which had once been our shared passion, suddenly became evidence of my limited thinking. Drew, we're spending so much time and money on this old house when we could be building something that actually scales, she'd say while I rewired the upstairs bathroom. Sloan says real estate is just tying up capital that could be generating actual returns in growth markets. The irony wasn't lost on me that she was criticizing our investment in a house that had already doubled in value since we'd bought it, but pointing that out just made her more frustrated with my narrow perspective on wealth building. I should have seen it coming when I returned from a particularly challenging commercial wiring job at a new office complex, my hands still black with electrical tape residue and my back aching from crawling through ceiling spaces all day, to find Victoria packing designer luggage I'd never seen before in our bedroom. The suitcases were expensive leather, the kind with brass hardware that costs more than most people spend on a vacation, and she was carefully folding clothes that looked like they belonged in a fashion magazine rather than our restored Victorian home where we'd spent 5 years building something together. She moved with this strange efficiency, like she'd been planning this moment for weeks while I was out working 12-hour days to support both our dreams, completely unaware that mine were about to be incinerated. Going somewhere? I asked, setting down my tool bag and trying to read her expression, which had this weird combination of determination and guilt that I'd never seen before. She didn't even look up from the silk blouses and designer jeans she was folding with careful precision. I'm moving to Chicago, she announced with casual indifference, like she was mentioning a change in dinner plans rather than the end of our entire relationship. Sloan offered me a full partnership in her agency, and it's exactly the opportunity I've been waiting for. The words hit me like touching a live wire, that split second of shock before the real pain sets in. Partnership? Victoria, we've never even talked about you moving. What about our plans? What about the renovation business? She finally looked at me then, and I saw something in her eyes that made my stomach drop. It wasn't sadness or regret, it was relief, like she'd been carrying around a secret that was finally being revealed. Drew, I need to tell you something I probably should have mentioned earlier, she said, and the careful way she phrased it let me know this was going to hurt. Sloan and I have been romantically involved for about 4 months now. We're in love, and this partnership is both professional and personal. For months. 4 months of weekend trips to Chicago that I'd supported financially and emotionally, thinking I was helping my girlfriend advance her career when she was actually building a new life with someone else. 4 months of her coming home with stories about collaborative projects and strategic planning sessions that were apparently just elaborate cover stories for an affair. 4 months, I repeated, trying to process the timeline. So when you went to that conference in February, when you said you were working late on campaigns, when you needed money for those new clothes? I was figuring out what I actually wanted from life, she interrupted, and there was this defensive edge in her voice like I was being unreasonable for feeling betrayed. And what I want isn't this. She gestured around our bedroom, at the carefully restored crown molding and the vintage light fixtures we'd spent months hunting down, like our entire shared life was suddenly evidence of some terrible mistake she'd made. When I asked about our 5-year relationship and all the renovation plans we'd made together, the business we were going to start, the future we'd been building room by room, Victoria actually laughed. Not a bitter laugh or an apologetic laugh, but this genuinely amused sound like I'd said something quaint and ridiculous. You realize you're just my backup option, right? She said, and the casual cruelty of it hit harder than any screaming match could have. Drew, you're reliable and sweet. But let's be honest about what this has always been, you've been my safety plan while I figured out what I actually wanted from life. She gestured dismissively at our carefully restored home, at the electrical work I'd done by hand, at the vintage fixtures we'd selected together during countless weekend trips. This whole thing has been practice for the real thing. Sloan can offer me genuine financial security and creative opportunities that actually match my potential instead of limiting it to some small-time house-flipping operation in Minneapolis. The words, backup option, kept echoing in my head while she explained how Sloan's agency represented everything she'd been working toward, how Chicago had the kind of high-end clients who understood real luxury and sophistication, how she'd outgrown both Minneapolis and me without even realizing it was happening. I thought we meant something to each other, I said, and immediately hated how pathetic it sounded. We did mean something, she replied, folding a cashmere sweater that definitely hadn't come from her Minneapolis income. You taught me what I didn't want in a relationship. You showed me the difference between settling for comfortable and actually reaching for something extraordinary. I drove straight to my best friend Tyler's apartment in St. Paul without calling ahead, sitting in my truck outside his building for 20 minutes before I could bring myself to get out and walk to his door. When Tyler opened it, he took one look at my face and stepped aside without saying a word, grabbing 2 beers from his fridge while I sat on his couch in stunned silence, trying to figure out how to explain that my entire life had just been revealed as an elaborate lie. She left, I finally said, and Tyler sat down across from me, waiting for the rest of the story with the kind of patience that comes from 15 years of friendship. After I told him everything, the affair, the partnership, the backup option comment that kept playing on repeat in my head, Tyler made disgusted noises about Victoria's coldness while I felt strangely empty rather than angry, like I was watching someone else's life implode from a safe emotional distance. Dude, that's beyond cold, Tyler said, shaking his head. Backup option? Who says that to someone they've been with for 5 years? But the weird thing was, I wasn't devastated like I thought I'd be. I was just hollow, like someone had scooped out all my emotions and left behind this strange clarity that made everything seem obvious in hindsight. I should have seen it coming, I said, taking a long pull from my beer. All those trips to Chicago, the new clothes, the way she started talking about everything we built together like it was holding her back. Tyler offered to let me crash on his couch for as long as I needed, but I spent the weekend helping him install a new electrical panel in his basement instead, letting the familiar work fill the space where emotions should have been. There's something therapeutic about working with your hands when your world falls apart. The methodical process of connecting wires and checking voltage makes sense when nothing else does. By Monday, I decided to treat Victoria's departure like a problem to be solved efficiently rather than a tragedy to be mourned, approaching it with the same systematic thinking I used for complex electrical jobs. I returned to our house while Victoria was at work, packing only my essential belongings and leaving behind everything we'd restored together because none of it held the same meaning anymore. The vintage light fixtures we'd hunted down at antique shops, the carefully refinished hardwood floors, the crown molding I'd painstakingly repaired, all of it felt like artifacts from someone else's relationship, beautiful but irrelevant to my actual life. I loaded my tools, my clothes, my books about electrical codes, and my collection of vintage electrical meters into my truck, leaving behind the furniture and decorative items that had been ours, but were really just props in Victoria's 5-year audition for something better. The hardest part was walking through rooms where we'd worked side by side, seeing the evidence of all those weekends spent believing we were building something permanent together. But even that felt distant, like looking at photographs of a vacation you'd forgotten taking. I left my key on the kitchen counter with a note saying, "Good luck with everything." Not sarcastic, just genuinely wishing her well with the life she'd chosen over the one we'd built together. I immediately blocked Victoria on all social media platforms, deleted her contact information from my phone, and found a small apartment near my electrical contracting office where I could start over without constant reminders of our shared history. The apartment was nothing special, a basic one-bedroom in a converted warehouse building, but it had good natural light and enough space for a small workshop where I could work on side projects. Tyler helped me move the last of my stuff on Tuesday evening, and we ordered pizza and drank beer while I set up my tools in the corner that would become my new workspace. "You're handling this really well," Tyler observed, watching me organize my electrical testing equipment with the same methodical care I'd always used. "Too well, maybe. Are you sure you're not just in shock?" I thought about that while I sorted wire nuts and electrical tape into labeled containers. Maybe I was in shock, but it felt more like waking up from a dream I'd been having for 5 years. "I think I'm relieved," I said, and realized it was true. I was working so hard to make someone happy who was never going to be happy with what I could offer. Now I don't have to pretend that was sustainable. The year following Victoria's departure became the most productive period of my professional life, as I channeled my newfound focus into earning my master electrician certification ahead of schedule and starting my own contracting business specializing in historical home restoration. Without the constant drain of funding someone else's lifestyle and dreams, I could finally invest in myself, better tools, advanced training courses, and the kind of professional development that actually mattered for building a sustainable career. I passed my master electrician exam 6 months early, scoring in the top 5%, and immediately started Drew Larson Electrical with a focus on the vintage wiring challenges that most contractors avoided because they required actual skill and patience rather than just replacing everything with modern materials. My expertise in vintage electrical systems made me highly sought after among Minneapolis homeowners renovating old properties, the kind of people who appreciated craftsmanship and were willing to pay for someone who understood the difference between restoration and renovation. Within 18 months, I had a waiting list of clients and enough steady income to buy a charming craftsman bungalow in the Longfellow neighborhood with a detached workshop perfect for my electrical projects and the side business I'd started refurbishing vintage electrical fixtures. The house was everything our Victorian had been trying to become: authentic, well-maintained, with character that didn't need to be artificially created through expensive renovation projects. Tyler suggested joining a hiking club to meet people outside work, partly because he was tired of me spending every weekend alone in my workshop, and partly because he thought I needed to prove to myself that I could connect with people who weren't paying me to fix their electrical problems. The Twin Cities Hiking Club met every Saturday morning at different trailheads around Minnesota, and while I was initially skeptical about group activities, I discovered that I genuinely enjoyed the quiet camaraderie of people who appreciated being outdoors without needing to document every moment for social media. The hiking led me to discover my love for rock climbing at the local climbing gym, where the methodical problem-solving required to find the right route up a wall appealed to the same part of my brain that enjoyed troubleshooting complex electrical issues. That's where I met Grace, a physical therapist who volunteered teaching adaptive climbing techniques to people with disabilities, helping them achieve things they thought impossible with patience, encouragement, and creative problem-solving that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with restoration work in the first place. Grace had warm hazel eyes that lit up when she talked about her patients' breakthroughs, an infectious laugh that made everyone around her feel more optimistic, and the kind of genuine confidence that came from helping others rather than seeking validation through expensive purchases or social media followers. She appreciated my methodical approach to both climbing and life without trying to change my fundamental nature, asking thoughtful questions about electrical work instead of dismissing it as boring or traditional, and showing genuine interest in the historical houses I was restoring around the city. Our relationship developed naturally over months of weekend climbing trips and quiet evenings working on our respective hobbies, Grace refinishing furniture she'd bought at estate sales in my workshop while I taught her basic electrical skills for her own home projects. She'd bring over pieces that needed rewiring or lamp bases that required new sockets, and we'd work side by side while talking about everything from her physical therapy cases to my latest electrical challenges, building the kind of comfortable partnership I'd thought I'd had with Victoria but realized now had been completely one-sided. Grace never made me feel like I needed to be more than I was or different from who I was, never compared me to other men or suggested that my career was somehow limiting her potential. Instead, she made me feel like the person I'd always been was exactly who she wanted to be with, and that revelation was more healing than all the therapy in the world could have provided. The contrast between Grace and Victoria became clearer every day we spent together, not because I was constantly comparing them, but because Grace's genuine appreciation for who I was highlighted how much energy I'd been spending trying to be someone else for 5 years. When I told Grace stories about particularly challenging electrical jobs, she'd ask follow-up questions about the technical solutions I'd found, genuinely curious about how I'd figured out problems that stumped other contractors. When Victoria used to ask about work, it was always perfunctory, a polite question before steering the conversation toward her clients or her networking events or whatever expensive thing she'd seen that day. Grace would get excited about my successes, landing a big restoration contract, solving a particularly tricky wiring puzzle, getting referrals from satisfied customers who appreciated quality work. She celebrated my professional growth like it mattered to her personally, not because it affected her lifestyle but because she cared about my happiness and fulfillment. The financial relief of not supporting someone else's delusions of grandeur allowed me to actually enjoy the money I was earning for the first time in years. I could afford the high-quality tools that made my work more efficient, take advanced electrical courses that expanded my expertise, and even save money for the future without constantly calculating whether I could afford Grace's latest professional development fantasy. Grace and I would go out to dinner and split the check without drama, take weekend trips where we both contributed equally, buy each other thoughtful gifts that showed we'd been paying attention rather than trying to impress with price tags. 2.5 years after Victoria's dramatic exit, Tyler called with news that her upgrade to Chicago had spectacularly backfired when Sloan's luxury branding agency was exposed as an elaborate Ponzi scheme targeting wealthy clients seeking exclusive marketing services. "Dude, you're not going to believe this," Tyler said, and I could hear the amazement in his voice. "Remember Victoria's fancy girlfriend with the boutique agency? Turns out she was running a total scam." According to the news articles Tyler was reading, Sloan had been using Victoria's Minneapolis tech connections to recruit new victims while systematically draining existing clients' marketing budgets through fake campaigns and inflated service contracts that never delivered the promised results. The FBI investigation revealed that Sloan had been charging clients $50,000 for marketing strategies that consisted mostly of stock photos and generic social media templates, using the money to fund her expensive lifestyle and office space while stringing clients along with promises of exclusive brand partnerships that didn't exist. Victoria lost her savings to legal fees when investigators discovered her signature on contracts that made her legally liable for services the agency had never actually provided, facing potential fraud charges that could have landed her in federal prison if prosecutors hadn't determined she was more victim than accomplice. She'd signed dozens of contracts without reading them, trusting Sloan completely and assuming that someone who lived so luxuriously must know what they were doing, never questioning why clients were paying so much for marketing work that seemed surprisingly similar from campaign to campaign. The partnership Victoria had been so excited about turned out to be a way for Sloan to use her credentials and connections while keeping her legally responsible for the fraudulent contracts, making Victoria the perfect fall guy when the scheme inevitably collapsed. When the FBI raided Sloan's office, they discovered that most of the expensive furniture and art had been rented for appearances, the international business expansion was pure fantasy, and Sloan had disappeared to Europe with the remaining money, leaving Victoria unemployed, blacklisted in the marketing industry, and facing a mountain of legal bills from trying to prove her innocence. "She's completely broke," Tyler reported with a mixture of schadenfreude and genuine pity. "Lost her apartment, had to sell her car, moved back in with her parents in some suburb. And get this, she's been trying to reach out to people here, asking for money and claiming she was framed." Victoria began desperately attempting to contact me through mutual friends, creating fake social media accounts after discovering I'd blocked her everywhere, and even calling my electrical contracting business pretending to need emergency repair services just to get me on the phone. The messages started innocent enough, casual, checking in attempts that pretended nothing significant had happened between us, like she was just an old friend wanting to reconnect after a few years of natural distance. But they quickly escalated to manipulative pleas about being framed by someone she trusted, needing financial help from someone who really knew her character, and increasingly desperate attempts to convince me that her legal troubles were the result of being naive and trusting rather than the predictable consequences of chasing easy money and luxury lifestyles. The late-night voicemails were the worst part, slurred and rambling messages where she'd cry about how unfair everything was, how she'd been taken advantage of by someone she thought loved her, how she just needed $25,000 in legal fees to clear her name and start over. "Drew, please, you're the only person who ever genuinely cared about me," she'd sob into my voicemail at 2 a.m., apparently forgetting that she'd told me I was just her backup option while packing to leave me for someone with more money. "I know I hurt you, but you know I'm not a criminal. I just need help from someone who understands who I really am." I was at my electrical contracting office planning my honeymoon to New Zealand with Grace, who was now my wife of 3 months, when Victoria showed up unannounced looking haggard and desperate after apparently tracking down my business address through public records. The woman standing in my doorway bore little resemblance to the confident, entitled princess I'd dated for 5 years. She had lost significant weight, her designer clothes replaced by wrinkled clearance rack items, and her eyes held the frantic look of someone who had exhausted all other options before resorting to this final humiliation. "Drew," she said, and her voice cracked immediately. "Thank God you're here. I need to talk to you." Grace and I had been spreading out travel brochures and discussing whether to spend more time on the North or South Island, celebrating the fact that we could afford a real honeymoon because our relationship was built on partnership rather than one person subsidizing another's lifestyle. Victoria's sudden appearance felt like a ghost from a past life, someone who belonged to a version of myself I'd outgrown completely. She launched into a rehearsed speech about how she'd made terrible mistakes and realized that what we'd shared was real love, that she'd foolishly abandoned for superficial attractions, alternating between apologizing for her past cruelty and demanding financial help as if our history obligated me to rescue her from consequences of her own choices. "I know I hurt you badly," she said, tears already streaming down her face. "But Drew, you have to understand, I was young and confused about what I wanted. Sloan manipulated me, made me think I needed things I didn't actually need. What we had was genuine, and I threw it away for someone who was using me." The desperation in her voice was genuine, but so was the entitlement that made her assume I'd want to help her after she treated me like a disposable convenience. "I'm in serious legal trouble," she continued when I didn't immediately respond with sympathy. "The lawyers say I need at least $25,000 for a decent defense, And my parents can't help because they're barely getting by themselves. You're the only person who ever really knew me, who understood my character." When I calmly explained that I was happily married and not interested in rehashing our past, Victoria became increasingly agitated and threatened to contact Grace with information about our relationship that might damage my marriage. "Your wife needs to know what kind of man she married," Victoria said, her voice taking on that manipulative edge I remembered from our worst fights. "She needs to know about the things you said about other women, about how you treated me when you were angry." I pulled out my phone and started dialing Grace's number. "Here, let me call her right now so you can tell her whatever you think she needs to know." Victoria's face went white. "What are you doing?" "You said Grace needs to know something about me," I said, holding up the phone where she could see Grace's contact photo. "So let's call her. Grace knows everything about our relationship, including the part where you told me I was just your backup option. She also knows about these desperate attempts you've been making to contact me for money." The manipulation attempt collapsed as Victoria realized that I had found someone who chose me first and that her nuclear option would only reinforce how much better my life was without her. Grace answered on the second ring, her voice warm and curious. "Hey babe, what's up?" "My ex Victoria is here at the office," I said calmly. "She says she has something important to tell you about our relationship. Want to talk to her?" There was a pause, then Grace's amused laugh. "The one who called you her backup option? Sure, put her on. I'm curious what she thinks I don't know." Victoria backed toward the door, shaking her head frantically. "No, I made a mistake coming here." "Drew," Grace continued, her voice carrying clearly through the phone, "tell her I said thanks for leaving you available when I came along. Best thing that ever happened to me was meeting a man who knew his own worth." Victoria's final manipulation attempt had not just failed but had turned into a public demonstration of how completely I'd moved on from the relationship she'd destroyed. She stood there for a moment looking between me and the phone, probably calculating whether there was any angle left to play, any way to regain control of a situation where she held no cards. "I hope you're happy," she said finally, bitterness replacing desperation in her voice. "I am," I replied simply. "Grace makes sure of that every day." Victoria gathered what remained of her dignity and walked toward the door, then paused and turned back one last time. "You could have helped me," she said. "After everything we shared, you could have shown some compassion." "I did help you," I said. "I stayed out of your way while you figured out what you actually wanted. Turns out that was the best thing I could have done for both of us." As the door closed behind her, I could hear Grace laughing on the phone. "Was that as pathetic as it sounded?" she asked. "Worse," I said, sitting back down at my desk covered with honeymoon planning materials. "But it's over now." That night, Grace and I finished planning our New Zealand itinerary while I told her the full story of Victoria's visit. "She really thought you'd give her money?" Grace asked, curled up against me on our couch. "After everything she put you through?" "She thought I'd still be the same guy she left," I said. "Someone desperate enough to pay for her attention." Grace looked up at me with those warm hazel eyes that had never held calculation or disappointment. "Good thing you're not that guy anymore. Good thing I met someone who never wanted me to be."